Hi, this is Kyle Sufkowski for AP Gov, and in this video we're going to be looking at how the presidency has morphed into one of the most powerful branches of government, and arguably certainly you can look at executive orders as well as other powers of the president in terms of coming to that conclusion. So we know that the president already has various informal powers, everything from morale builder to crisis manager to budget setter. And these are things that are not listed in Article 2 of the Constitution, but the president has already assumed this, and we've seen a growing concentration of power in the presidency since the time of the 1930s with FDR, really, expanding the power and the roles of the presidency. I mean, for example, prior to the 1930s, nobody really looked to the president to stimulate the economy, but upon the Great Depression, people are now looking to FDR, and he assumes this role as being sort of the manager of the economy. And today, we certainly look to the president, whether or not they really have all that much control to help the economy, as a manager of the budget, regardless. So I start off with this idea, and this comes from an author who published a book, I believe in the 1970s or maybe early 1980s, with the last name Schlesinger, and he comes up with this idea that our presidency really mirrors an imperial presidency. And this has happened as a result of economic growth that has basically necessitated the need for a strong executive branch, and that Congress has been happy enough to delegate a lot of its strong powers to the executive branch, especially when we look at the areas of foreign policy. And some question, well, do we need this in an age of terrorism? Do we need a quick acting branch to be able to deal with foreign policy issues, especially when wars now happen a lot more quickly? And as we go through this, think about this. When we look at Bush and Obama, were they an imperial president? Is Trump trending this way? And then also ask your question, is it bad to even have an imperial president? So let's look at some of the buildup as to why the presidency, especially in my opinion, is the most powerful branch of the three. But let's start with war powers. Well, certainly we know there's a conflict there, right? The president is the commander-in-chief, but Congress also has the right to declare war in Article 1. And what's incredible is that the last time the United States has officially declared war was technically World War II. So the Korean War, not a war. If you look at the Vietnam War, not a war. War in Iraq and Afghanistan and Iraq, technically not a war. Those were instances in which the president utilized his power of commander-in-chief to do so. Now, some say this is really needed in a changing world. Back in the day, yes, Congress could mull over the decision about whether or not to declare war. War happened a lot more slowly compared to today. So what's incredible is that presidents have sent in the troops over 125 times without Congress even saying a peep, and they've gone along with that. That's very, very powerful for one person to make that decision. What about the veto power? The mere threat of a veto can certainly influence changes in legislation. It is very difficult to override one particular president, and again, because that requires a two-thirds vote, and most political parties do not have two-thirds of that vote in either house of Congress. What's incredible is that around 93% on average of vetoes are sustained, so they're not even challenged. Again, the mere threat of a veto can be enough to influence changes or even derail legislation. Now, when you look at presidential vetoes, it's quite amazing. When you look at FDR, 635 vetoes. Out of that 635, only 9 have been overridden. Now, you look at others, certainly much less, but 21 with Kennedy, 0, 30 with Johnson, 0. But even today, you see the number of vetoes has significantly decreased. Again, the mere threat of a veto is enough to derail the legislation or influence changes. Again, even today, very difficult to see those vetoes be overridden by Congress. Another important part as to why the presidency has strengthened over time is something called executive privilege, and this refers to private communication between himself and principal advisors. It's the idea that this should be basically privileged speech, that some stuff you want the president to be honest with his advisors and give feedback, back and forth. There's nothing in the Constitution that actually supports this. This has just been a thing that's been done by tradition. Now, some constitutional basis for allowing executive privilege is that there is a separation of powers, that one branch, such as Congress, should not be inquiring about the internal workings of another branch, right? The branches are supposed to be supreme in their responsibilities. They should not be meddling in other one's affairs. And the argument, again, presidents and advisors need assurance of private discussion, especially with national security issues, that, again, Congress should not be meddling into what the president is talking about with his advisors. What's interesting is that this is not questioned until the Watergate scandal. And a famous Supreme Court case known as U.S. v. Nixon said basically, well, there is no absolute privilege of immunity. You are not immune, President Nixon. And this was a significant case that finally limited presidential expansion through executive privilege with this Supreme Court case. So this, of course, is going to force Nixon to turn over documents and internal private communication with respect to the Watergate scandal. But certainly executive privilege is sometimes claimed, and sometimes it takes a Supreme Court case to say, well, no absolute privilege of immunity. And here is, again, a political cartoon. You see Barack Obama saying, oh, executive privilege, it's my invincibility cloak. In some ways, yes, I mean, executive privilege can work that way. Another important reason why the presidency has expanded quite significantly is the use of executive orders. This refers to when the president can issue these which have the force of law relating to the Constitution, treaties, or legislative statutes. And basically, it's going to direct an executive agency as to how to administer a law. Sometimes the laws are a little unclear and they need directive. It is also sometimes used when Congress opposes the president's agenda and the president feels like he has no other option. So as a result, we saw this a lot, especially with President Obama with immigration, that Congress wasn't cooperating with him because they were the opposing political party. And as a result, he made executive orders. So this has been done by many, many presidents. The only restriction is that it has to be published in the Federal Register, which is a daily publication of the U.S. government. These orders are not overturned all that much. Again, who's really checking the president's power? Not a lot of people or a lot of branches, because, again, the presidents really, for the most part, are not going to be overturned. Now, it's also fair to say that presidents don't issue them if they anticipate a veto-proof majority against them. Certainly, if they certainly might get overridden or perhaps are not constitutionally sound, they are not allowed to do this. Now, where's the constitutional basis of this? Again, executive order is not listed as a formal power, but if you try to etch something out of the Article 2 in the Constitution, it would be that the president has to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Well, how does the president do that? That comes through executive orders. So right here, you have an implied power that allows for executive orders to be utilized. Again, executive order, very, very powerful tool for the president. And Donald Trump has used these quite frequently and quite often. So if you already look within the first 2 weeks, you see Trump used it 8 times, Obama 9. So again, this could be a result of divided government. We see prior to that, Truman had 7, but not all that utilized in the first 2 weeks. But President Trump, as well as Obama, more frequently, and again, that could be an effect of divided government. Moving on. Impoundment. This is a presidential practice of refusing to spend money appropriated by Congress, and this was done by President Nixon. Ultimately, this was outlawed by the Budget Reform and Impoundment Act of 1974. So Congress has the power of the purse, and so let's say it allocates $10 million for some program that the president doesn't support. And remember, the president is supposed to execute this with funding from Congress, and the president just says, we're going to not utilize the funds. We're not going to spend it. Well, that is outlawed under the Budget Reform and Impoundment Act, saying that you cannot impound money. You have to spend it because Congress ultimately has the power of the purse. So this was also another check, and again, under Nixon, on the imperial presidency. But again, if you really look at executive orders, executive privilege, war powers, veto power, that is a lot of power right there for the president, for one person. So certainly there are concerns that linger. Some say that there are already too many checks and balances on the president, whereas others say, well, you have a president that mirrors a king or some type of monarch. Ultimately, the president has certainly increase the amount of power over time, starting with FDR. But at the end of the day, Americans expect a lot from presidents. Look at all the formal and informal powers that the presidency has assumed. Ultimately, the president is part of the larger organization of the government, and you have tasks that you have to execute under Article 2. While the president has to work and lead Congress, that can be difficult, especially under divided government, and that might be a reason why executive orders are being more frequently used. Ultimately, presidential roles and responsibilities, even national security, are tied to the Madisonian system of checks and balances, because at the end of the day, if the president issues an executive order that's unconstitutional, it will be challenged, it will go to the courts, and they will make a ruling. Or Congress can simply override that executive order and pass a more narrow law that overrides that particular executive order. So again, there are still checks and balances. It's not just with the stroke of a pen and that's the final word. So certainly there are some checks involved here. But think about that. Is the power of the presidency too large and should it be checked? Or is it needed in this time of uncertainty when anything can happen at the click of a button, a snap of a finger? So that is certainly a question for you to think about.